On May 21st, 1810, in a shabby London boarding house, an 81-year-old woman breathed her last. For 33 years, she had lived as a pious, impoverished, and solitary figure. But when the undertakers stripped away her tattered garments, a piercing scream shattered the silence, sending shockwaves through the British medical community. The body lying before them was not that of an elderly woman, but of a man, his skin mapped with the crisscrossing scars of war. That stark truth settled the greatest wager of the 18th century, yet it raised a question more haunting than ever before. How did one of Europe's finest swordsmen come to accept burying his blade beneath layers of petticoats? And was this a punishment or the greatest disguise in history? To truly understand the magnitude of this transformation, we must leave the gilded cages of Versailles and travel back half a century to a small, unassuming town in the Burgundy region called Tonnerre. The year was 1728. The air was filled with the smell of vineyards and the damp earth of the French countryside. In the noble house of the D'Eon family, a child was born on the 5th of October. The family was noble, yes, but they were of the petite noblesse, land-rich perhaps, but cash-poor, constantly struggling to maintain appearances while creditors knocked at the door. The father, Louis D'Eon, was a man of ambition but little financial sense, a director of the king's domains who spent more time managing lawsuits than managing his estate. The mother, Françoise, was a woman of immense patience and hidden strength. When the child was brought into the world, the chaos that would define D'Eon's life began immediately. The baptismal register of the local church records the infant's name: Charles Geneviève Louis Auguste André Timothée D'Eon de Beaumont. A string of names, both male and female, as was the custom for Catholic nobility to honor various godparents and saints. But there was a hesitation in the room. D'Eon would later write in memoirs that when the midwife first examined the newborn, she announced to the room, "It is a girl." A moment later, amidst the confusion and the clearing of the infant's lungs, the declaration was retracted. "No, wait, it is a boy." The family, desperate for a male heir to inherit the title and the mounting debts, seized upon the correction. The child was recorded as a son. The church bells rang for a boy. But the seed of doubt had been planted before the umbilical cord was even cut. Growing up in Tonnerre, the young Charles was a creature of delicate beauty. He did not have the rough, tumbling physicality of the other boys in the village. He was slight, with fine features, porcelain skin, and a lack of body hair that would persist into adulthood. His mother, perhaps sensing something that the father refused to see, or perhaps simply indulging a whim, would occasionally dress the young child in the clothes of his sisters. In the 18th century, all children under the age of 5 wore skirts, but for Charles, this period of gender neutrality seemed to stretch longer. A comfortable haze before the rigid expectations of masculinity were clamped down upon him. Despite the softness of his appearance, his mind was sharp as a razor. The D'Eon family, realizing that their fortune could not be saved by land, pinned their hopes on the boy's intellect. He was sent to Paris for an education that would have broken a lesser student. He attended the prestigious Collège Mazarin, a place where the sons of the elite were drilled in Latin, theology, philosophy, and the law. Charles devoured it all. He was not just a student, he was a phenomenon. He could recite Cicero by heart, debate the finer points of civil law, and write with a flourish that was both elegant and biting. But it was not just his mind that was being trained. Paris in the 1740s was a city of contradictions. It was the center of the Enlightenment, where philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were challenging the existence of God and the rights of kings. Yet it was also a city of medieval squalor and strict social hierarchies. To survive in Paris, a gentleman needed more than just a sharp tongue. He needed a sharp sword. Charles, small and often mocked for his effeminate appearance, his voice remained high, his chin smooth, entered the fencing academies. The fencing masters initially looked at the slight boy with skepticism. He looked like he would break under the weight of a foil. But when Charles took his stance, something transformed. He was fast, incredibly fast. What he lacked in brute strength, he made up for in agility and a terrifying precision. He fought like a mathematician, calculating angles and weaknesses in a split second. He learned to use his opponent's size against them, parrying heavy blows and slipping inside their guard to deliver the touch. The fencing hall became the first place where D'Eon proved that appearance was a lie. The pretty boy who looked like a girl could kill you. This duality, the feminine exterior masking a lethal masculine aggression, became the weapon he would sharpen for the rest of his life. By his early 20s, D'Eon was a qualified lawyer and a secretary to the fiscal department of the government. He was efficient, tireless, and brilliantly organized. He caught the eye of the Prince of Conti, a cousin of the king and one of the most powerful men in France. But the Prince of Conti was not looking for a lawyer. He was looking for a ghost. At this time, King Louis XV was running a secret government. While his official ministers debated in the open court, the king had created the secret du roi, the king's secret. This was a clandestine network of spies and agents who answered only to the monarch, often pursuing foreign policy goals that directly contradicted the official stance of France. It was a treasonous loyalty, a shadow state. The king needed an agent to go to Russia. France was desperate to ally with Empress Elizabeth of Russia to counter the rising power of Great Britain and Prussia. But the British had blockaded St. Petersburg. No French male diplomats were allowed near the Empress. The British spies were everywhere, watching every carriage and every ship. The Prince of Conti looked at D'Eon. He saw the intellect, the loyalty, and the fencing skills. But he also saw the smooth face, the small hands, the slight build. He saw an opportunity that no other agent could provide. The legend, and it is a legend D'Eon himself cultivated, though historians debate its exact veracity, is that the prince and the king hatched a plan that was as audacious as it was ridiculous. If a French man could not enter the Russian court, perhaps a French woman could. In 1756, a young traveler named Leah de Beaumont arrived in St. Petersburg. Leah was charming, demure, and dressed in the height of Parisian fashion. She carried books of philosophy and had a wit that sparkled in the dull, frozen winters of Russia. She gained access to the inner circle of Empress Elizabeth, who was known for her love of anything French and her fondness for beautiful women. Leah became a reader to the Empress, sitting at the bedside of the most powerful woman in the East, whispering stories, and eventually whispering politics. Inside the bodice of Leah's dress, or perhaps sewn into the binding of a book, was a letter from Louis XV. It was a secret proposition for an alliance, a letter that would have been confiscated and destroyed had it been carried by a man. Leah delivered the letter. The alliance was saved. And in the midst of this high-stakes espionage, the young French lawyer was learning a profound lesson. Gender was a performance. If you walked like a woman, talked like a woman, and dressed like a woman, the world would treat you as a woman, even if you were a trained swordsman with a mission from the king. But the mission required another turn of the screw. Once the initial contact was made, Leah had to vanish so that the official diplomat, the Chevalier D'Eon, could arrive to formalize the treaty. D'Eon left Russia, only to return days later in the uniform of a male secretary, claiming to be Leah's brother. The court accepted this without blinking. They remarked on the family resemblance, how the brother had the same delicate features as the sister, but no one suspected they were one and the same. For D'Eon, this must have been a moment of supreme, intoxicating power. To fool an empress, to fool the British spies, to fool the entire Russian court, it was a drug. He was the master of the mask. However, the life of a spy is not just ballrooms and whispers. War was coming. The 7 Years' War erupted, setting Europe and the colonies ablaze. D'Eon, despite his success as a diplomat, yearned for the validation that only blood could provide. He wanted to prove his manhood in the most undeniable way possible. He requested a commission in the dragoons, the heavy cavalry. Imagine the sight: D'Eon, barely 5 feet tall, mounting a massive warhorse, drawing a heavy saber and charging into the lines of the Prussian infantry. At the Battle of Willinghausen in 1761, he fought with a reckless abandon that bordered on suicidal. He led his troop into a hail of musket fire. He was responsible for carrying ammunition under enemy bombardment. He was wounded in the head and the thigh, his uniform soaked in blood and mud. The soldiers, who might have snickered at his effeminate voice in the mess hall, fell silent when they saw him on the field. He was ferocious. When the war ended, France had been humiliated, losing its colonies in America and India, but D'Eon emerged as a hero. He was awarded the Croix de Saint-Louis. He was now officially a chevalier, a knight. He had the scars, the medal, and the rank. He had done everything a man could do to prove he was a man, and yet the rumors followed him like a shadow. "He is too pretty for a soldier," they whispered. "He has no beard. Why has he never taken a wife? What really happened in Russia?" In 1763, the king, needing his most capable and slippery agent for the most difficult mission of all, sent D'Eon to London. He was appointed as a minister plenipotentiary, a high-ranking diplomat with the power to negotiate the peace treaty that would officially end the war. But this was only the cover. His real mission, the secret du roi, was far darker. Louis XV, still stinging from the loss of the war, wanted D'Eon to survey the British coastline and draw up detailed plans for a French invasion of England. D'Eon arrived in London at the height of his glory. He was 35 years old, a war hero, a celebrated intellectual, and the representative of the most powerful culture in Europe. He took a grand house in Soho. He imported wine by the barrel. He threw lavish dinners for the British aristocracy, charming them with his stories while secretly mapping their defenses. He was living like a prince. But D'Eon had a fatal flaw: his pride. He was arrogant, volatile, and deeply insecure about his status. He spent money he didn't have, assuming the king would reimburse him. He wrote letters to Versailles that were borderline insubordinate, demanding more funds, more respect, more titles. The French foreign minister, the Duc de Praslin, grew tired of this upstart from the petite noblesse. He decided to replace D'Eon with a new ambassador, the Count de Guerchy. But Guerchy was not just a replacement. He was a humiliation. He was a man D'Eon despised, a man D'Eon considered incompetent and cowardly. Worse, D'Eon was ordered to step down to a lowly secretary role and serve under Guerchy. For D'Eon, this was intolerable. It was a public castration of his status. And so, the spy did something unthinkable. He went rogue. When the order came to return to France, D'Eon refused. He barricaded himself in his London house. He hinted to the British press that he knew secrets that could bring down the French monarchy. He possessed the invasion plans, the king's handwritten letters, the proof of the secret du roi. If he released them, it would be an act of war. Louis XV would be exposed as a liar who was planning to invade a country he had just signed a peace treaty with. The standoff was electric. The French government tried to extradite him. They tried to poison him. There were attempts to kidnap him on the dark streets of London. D'Eon turned his house into a fortress, mining the staircases with explosives and sleeping with his dragoon pistols under his pillow. He was one man holding the French crown hostage. But in this high-stress crucible with the eyes of both nations upon him, the old whispers began to mutate into something new. It started in the tabloids. London was the capital of a free and vicious press, unlike the censored papers of Paris. The gossip columnists noticed D'Eon's smooth face, his reluctance to engage in romantic affairs with women, and the rumors drifting over from Russia about Leah. A question was asked, at first as a joke and then with increasing seriousness. Is the Chevalier D'Eon actually a woman? It was the perfect distraction. D'Eon was no longer just a rogue diplomat. He was a biological mystery. The British public, obsessed with gambling, saw an opportunity. The betting books at White's and the London Stock Exchange began to fill up. 50 guineas that the Chevalier is a woman. 100 guineas that he is a man. The odds shifted with every public appearance. If D'Eon wore a slightly more fitted coat, the odds on female went up. If he was seen drinking heavily, the odds on male rallied. At first, D'Eon was furious. He beat 2 bankers with his cane in a park for asking about his sex. He threatened to challenge anyone who bet on him to a duel. But as the debts piled up and the French government cut off his funds, D'Eon realized that this ambiguity was a shield. As long as people were confused about his sex, they were hesitant to attack him physically. The British police were reluctant to arrest a potential woman. The French agents were confused about how to handle him. And deep down, in the solitude of his fortified house, something else was happening. The mask was beginning to feel more like the face. D'Eon stopped fighting the rumors with the same vigor. He began to let the silence speak. He realized that the world was projecting a narrative onto him, and for the first time, he considered simply stepping into it. The betting frenzy reached a fever pitch in the early 1770s. It is estimated that over £120,000 was wagered on D'Eon's gender. It was a mania. People were analyzing the shape of his calves, the pitch of his voice, the way he held a teacup. He was the most famous person in London, not for what he did, but for what he was. In 1774, King Louis XV died. The protector of the secret was gone. The new king, Louis XVI, wanted to clean up the mess. He wanted the invasion plans back, and he wanted D'Eon silenced. He sent a new negotiator, the famous playwright Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the man who wrote The Barber of Seville. Beaumarchais was a man of the theater, a man who understood roles and costumes. When he met D'Eon in London, he didn't find the arrogant dragoon captain. He found a person who was exhausted, weeping, and desperate. It was in these private meetings with Beaumarchais that D'Eon made the confession that would seal his fate. "I am a woman," D'Eon told the playwright. "I have been a woman all along. My parents forced me to live as a boy to inherit their estate. I have served the king as a man, fought as a man, and bled as a man. But I can no longer keep up the charade. I am dying under the weight of these clothes." Was it the truth? Or was it the greatest lie of a master spy? If D'Eon was a woman, the betting scandal would be resolved. More importantly, if D'Eon was a woman, the king could hardly execute her or throw her in the Bastille. A woman could be forgiven for hysteria. A man could not be forgiven for treason. By declaring himself a woman, D'Eon was rendering himself harmless in the eyes of the patriarchy. Who would fear a spinster? It was a stroke of genius. Beaumarchais believed her. Or perhaps he pretended to, seeing a way to close the deal. He wrote to the king, "The Chevalier is a woman suffering in silence, a heroine of France." The king, moved by this narrative and eager to avoid a scandal, agreed to the terms. The invasion plans would be returned. D'Eon would receive a generous pension. But the king attached a condition that was essentially a sentence of social death for the Chevalier d'Eon, but a birth for the Chevalier. The king decreed that for the sake of public decency, d'Eon must stop wearing the disguise of a man. She must dress as a woman for the rest of her life. She was forbidden to ever wear a uniform or carry a sword again. D'Eon accepted. The pact was signed. The transaction was complete. The spy surrendered the papers and in return received a new identity. But before she could return to France, she had to prepare. She was 49 years old. Her body was scarred from war. Her skin was weather-beaten. She had the stride of a cavalryman. She could not simply put on a dress and expect to pass. She needed a transformation. And so the soldier began the strange, painful, and deeply lonely process of learning how to be the woman the king commanded her to be. The journey from London back to France in August of 1777 was not the triumphant return of a hero, nor was it the quiet retreat of a pensioner. It was a bizarre, tense procession. D'Eon traveled not in the carriage of a lady, but on post horses, riding hard and fast, dressed in the full, dusty uniform of the dragoons. Despite the signed agreement with the king, despite the tears shed before Beaumarchais, and despite the public declaration of her sex, d'Eon was dragging her feet. She was clinging to the last remnants of her masculinity with a desperation that was palpable. When she stopped at inns along the road to Paris, she drank wine with the men, swore like a trooper, and slapped her thigh with a leather glove. The world knew she was returning to become a woman, but she seemed determined to arrive as a man one last time. When d'Eon finally reached Versailles, the seat of French power, she did not go quietly to a dressmaker. She marched straight into the office of the Count de Vergennes, the foreign minister. Imagine the scene. The minister, a man of exquisite manners and powder, sitting behind his gilded desk, looking up to see a weather-beaten soldier, smelling of horse sweat and tobacco, demanding an audience. Vergennes was baffled. He had the king's order in his hand, the order that recognized d'Eon as a female. He expected a demure, perhaps eccentric, spinster. Instead, he was being shouted at by a cavalry captain who wanted to discuss military pensions and the next war with England. "Mademoiselle," Vergennes reportedly said, struggling with the pronoun, "you must understand the king's will. You are to resume the dress of your sex. You cannot remain in this attire." d'Eon argued. She claimed she had no clothes. She claimed she had no money to buy such fripperies. She claimed that after 50 years of wearing breeches, her legs would not know how to move under a skirt. It was a final frantic negotiation, but Louis XVI was not like his grandfather. He was a moralist, and he wanted order. The decree was enforced. d'Eon was told in no uncertain terms that she was not to appear in the presence of the royal family until she was properly attired. The dragoon uniform had to go. And here, history provides us with one of its most ironic twists. The person charged with overseeing this transformation, the architect of d'Eon's new appearance, was none other than Marie Antoinette. The queen, hearing of the female soldier, was fascinated. She was a woman who understood the power of fashion better than anyone in Europe. To her, this was not just a bureaucratic correction. It was a project. She commanded that her own personal dressmaker, the legendary Rose Bertin, be sent to d'Eon's residence. The crown would pay for the wardrobe. It was a trousseau fit for a duchess, funded by the state for a 49-year-old spy. The process of transformation, which took place over several weeks in the autumn of 1777, was documented with a mixture of humor and agony in D'Eon's letters. Rose Bertin and her army of seamstresses descended upon the soldier. They measured a body that had been hardened by fencing and riding. D'Eon had broad shoulders, thick muscular calves, and a complete lack of a waist. The corset, the fundamental cage of 18th century femininity, was a torture device for her. D'Eon wrote to a friend, "I am suffering the torments of the damned. To be squeezed into this whalebone prison is worse than any wound I took in Germany. My spirit is willing, but my ribs are breaking." It wasn't just the corset. It was the layers, the chemise, the petticoats, the panniers, side hoops to widen the skirt, the heavy silk overdress, the lace fichu to hide the neck, the bonnet to hide the receding hairline. D'Eon had to shave her face closely every morning, applying heavy layers of white lead powder to hide the shadow of a beard that had defied 50 years of suppression. She had to learn to walk all over again. A dragoon walks with a swagger, legs apart to balance on a moving deck or a horse. A lady glides, taking tiny steps so as not to kick her skirts. D'Eon tripped. She stumbled. She cursed in a way that made the seamstresses blush. "It is harder to equip a lady than a company of dragoons," she grumbled. Finally, the day of presentation arrived. October the 21st, 1777, the feast of St. Ursula. The Chevalier D'Eon was to be presented to the king and queen. The court was packed. Every duke, count, and hanger-on in Versailles had crowded into the Hall of Mirrors. They wanted to see the freak show. They wanted to see the spy in a skirt. When the doors opened, D'Eon entered. She was wearing a magnificent gown of black silk. She had insisted on black, claiming she was in mourning for her lost manhood, though others suggested it was simply more slimming. She wore the Cross of Saint Louis, her military medal, pinned prominently to her left breast, a shocking juxtaposition of male valor and female attire that had never been seen before. She walked with a strange rolling gait, struggling to manage the train of her dress. As she approached the king, she attempted to curtsy. It was a disaster. She lost her balance, her knees cracking audibly, and she nearly toppled over. A ripple of laughter went through the court. But D'Eon recovered. She straightened up, not like a lady, but like a soldier snapping to attention. She looked the king in the eye. Louis XVI, perhaps pitying her, or perhaps respecting the sheer audacity of the performance, spoke kindly to her. "Mademoiselle," he said, "we are pleased to see you in the dress that accords with your nature." He granted her a pension. He forbade her from leaving the kingdom. The queen was even more gracious, complimenting her dress, though she reportedly had to hide a smile behind her fan at the sight of the burly 5 o'clock shadowed debutante. The transformation was official. Charles was dead. Geneviève was alive. But if the court thought this would silence D'Eon, they were mistaken. The novelty of the Amazon of France wore off quickly for the courtiers, but for D'Eon, the reality of her new life was a slow, grinding suffocation. She had been a creature of action. Now she was relegated to the drawing room. She was sent to live for a time with the ladies of the court, to learn deportment. Imagine the torture of it. D'Eon, who had discussed treaties with Catherine the Great and invasion plans with prime ministers, was now forced to sit in a circle of noble women discussing embroidery, the price of silk, and the latest gossip. She was bored out of her mind. She wrote, "I am a lion in a cage. They want me to be a sheep, but I have claws." She would often forget herself in conversation. When the talk turned to politics, she would slam her fist on the table, hike up her skirts, and launch into a tirade about the incompetence of the French Navy, shocking the ladies who were fainting into their smelling salts. The intellectuals of Europe watched this spectacle with fascination. Voltaire, the great philosopher of the Enlightenment, wrote from his retreat near Geneva. He was skeptical. He had met D'Eon years before and had always considered him a slightly mad but brilliant young man. Now, Voltaire wrote, "This D'Eon is a nice problem for history. Is it a man? Is it a woman? It is a being apart." He suspected, as did many, that this was all a grand political theater, but he admitted that D'Eon played the part with a terrifying commitment. But the most poignant struggle was the internal one. D'Eon was now living the lie she had sold to the king. She had claimed to be a woman to escape her enemies, but now she had to be one. And in the process of acting, strange things began to happen. She began to take pride in her female identity. She began to rewrite her own history. She spent her days writing her memoirs, La vie militaire, politique et privée de Mademoiselle D'Eon. In these texts, she invented a childhood that never happened. She wrote about being born a girl, about her mother protecting her, about the pain of being forced into boys' clothes. Psychologists today look at this period and wonder, was D'Eon hallucinating, or was this a coping mechanism? By convincing herself that she had always been female, she made the humiliation of 1777 bearable. It wasn't a punishment, it was a restoration. She began to refer to her male past as my brother, or that other self. She fractured her psyche to survive. Yet the physical body rebelled. She was going through menopause, or rather the lack of it, since she was biologically male, but she mimicked the symptoms she heard other women discuss. She complained of hot flashes. She complained of vapors. She embraced the frailty that society expected of her, perhaps because it was the only way to explain why she wasn't fighting anymore. The sword was gone, so the body had to become weak. However, the warrior spirit was not dead, it was merely dormant. In 1778, France joined the American War of Independence against Britain. The drums of war were beating in Paris. The Marquis de Lafayette was sailing to America. D'Eon's blood boiled. She rushed to the war ministry, still in her dress, the cross of Saint Louis pinned to her bodice. She demanded a command. She offered to lead a regiment of women if they wouldn't give her men. "I can still fight," she shouted at the ministers. "My arm is as strong as ever. Let me die on the field of honor, not in a parlor." The government was horrified. The king's decree was specific. She was a woman and women did not fight. They threatened to throw her in the dungeon of the Château de Dijon if she didn't stop making a scene. This was the crushing blow. It wasn't the dress that broke D'Eon, it was the realization that the dress meant she was no longer a citizen with agency. She was a decoration. To silence her, the government effectively placed her under house arrest on her family estate in Tonnerre. She was exiled from Paris, exiled from London, and exiled from her own gender. For the next 6 years, the Chevalier D'Eon lived a quiet rural life in Tonnerre. She lived with her aging mother. She attended Mass. She managed the vineyards. The locals of Tonnerre, who had known her as a boy, now saw a pious spinster who walked with a heavy tread. But in the privacy of her library, she kept her swords polished. She practiced fencing in the barn, her skirts tied up around her waist, lunging and parrying against imaginary opponents. She was keeping the muscle memory alive. She knew somehow that the peace would not last. She knew that her pension, dependent on the whims of a bankrupt monarchy, was not secure, and she was right. In 1785, the clouds were gathering over France. The monarchy was running out of money. The pension checks stopped coming. D'Eon, now nearly 60, faced destitution. Her mother had died, leaving behind only debts. The winery was failing. France was on the brink of the revolution that would sweep away the world of kings and secrets. D'Eon realized she could no longer afford the quiet life of a noblewoman. She needed money. And where had she always been able to make money? In London, in the eye of the storm. She petitioned the government for permission to return to England, ostensibly to settle her debts and retrieve some lost books. The permission was granted, with the strict condition that she continue to dress as a woman. D'Eon packed her trunks. She packed her dresses, her corsets, and her wigs. But at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, she packed her foils. The Chevalier was going back to London, not as a diplomat this time, but as a spectacle. She was going to turn her identity into a livelihood. When she arrived in London in 1785, the city remembered her. The betting books were long closed. The money paid out to those who bet on female, since the French king's decree was taken as the final proof. But the curiosity remained. D'Eon set up a modest household and looked for a way to survive. She found it in the fencing halls. The fencing masters of London were initially skeptical. An old French lady wanted to fence? It seemed like a joke. But when D'Eon took the floor, the joke died instantly. She was slower now, yes, and heavier, but her technique was flawless. She became a sensation. The Hall of Arms at Carlton House, the Prince of Wales's own palace, invited her to perform. This brings us to one of the most iconic images of the 18th century, the Chevalier D'Eon, dressed in a voluminous black skirt with petticoats, a lace cap on her gray head, facing off against the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Saint-Georges was the Black Mozart, a mixed-race virtuoso violinist, and the undisputed deadliest swordsman in Europe. He was young, athletic, and in his prime. D'Eon was an old woman. The crowd held its breath. They fought. Saint-Georges, gallantly at first, tried to go easy on her. D'Eon would have none of it. She attacked, she lunged, her skirt swirled around her like a battle flag. She parried his thrusts with a wrist of iron, and then in a flurry of motion she scored a hit. A button on Saint-Georges' chest was tapped by her foil. The crowd erupted. It was impossible. It was magnificent. It was the ultimate proof that while the king could change her clothes, he could not change her nature. This fencing match became a symbol. Prints of the duel were sold all over London. D'Eon became a celebrity all over again, the invincible Amazon. But as the 1780s turned into the 1790s, the world was about to change in ways that fencing matches could not fix. Across the Channel, the Bastille had fallen. The head of Louis XVI, the man who had ordered her into a dress, rolled into a basket. The French Revolution had begun, and for a royalist spy living in London, the pension was gone forever. The old world was burning, and D'Eon was stranded in the wreckage, an old woman with a sword, facing a new century that had no place for her. The news of the fall of the Bastille in July 1789 did not reach London as a shout, but as a tremor. For the French exiles living in the fog-choked streets of Soho, it was the sound of the world cracking open. For the Chevalier D'Eon, sitting in her modest lodgings, the news was a double-edged sword. On one hand, she had been a victim of the old regime's arbitrary power. She had been exiled, silenced, and manipulated by kings and ministers who treated her like a pawn. The revolution promised liberty, a concept she had fought for in her own strange, solitary way for decades. On the other hand, she was a creature of the monarchy. Her pension, her cross of Saint Louis, her very identity as a chevalier, it all hung on the thread of royal authority. If the king fell, who would pay the salary of his most confusing subject? As the 1790s dawned, the Amazon of France found herself in a precarious position. The new revolutionary government in Paris was suspicious of everyone connected to the Secret du Roi. They saw D'Eon not as a hero, but as a relic of the corrupt past. And yet, the fire in her belly had not gone out. In 1792, as foreign armies gathered on the borders of France to crush the revolution, D'Eon did something that was pure, distilled madness, or perhaps pure patriotism. She picked up her quill. She wrote a letter to the National Assembly in Paris. Imagine the scene in the Revolutionary Chamber, a room full of angry, shouting Jacobins debating the fate of the nation, when a letter arrives from an elderly lady in London. In the letter, D'Eon, now 64 years old, offered her services to the Republic. She did not offer to knit socks or bandage wounds. She offered to raise and lead a division of Amazon women to fight on the front lines. "I offer you my arm," she wrote, the ink likely shaking with the force of her conviction. "It is still strong enough to strike the enemies of France. I have lived as a woman, but I can die like a soldier." The assembly read the letter. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by polite dismissal. To the revolutionaries, D'Eon was a joke, a senile old woman living in a fantasy world. They did not know that under the lace cap was the brain of a strategist who had mapped the English coast for an invasion. They rejected her offer. Citizeness Genevieve, as she now styled herself, was told to stay in London and be quiet. The rejection stung more than any sword wound. It was the final confirmation that no matter the regime, monarchy, or republic, there was no place for a woman warrior. Then came the blood. In January 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined. When the news reached London, D'Eon reportedly went into mourning, weeping for the man who had forced her into a dress, but had also protected her. With the king's head went D'Eon's pension. The flow of livres from Versailles stopped instantly. The Chevalier D'Eon, once the most talked about person in Europe, was now destitute. Poverty in 18th century London was a brutal, grinding thing. It was cold, dirty, and unforgiving. D'Eon, who had once thrown banquets where wine flowed like water, now had to count every penny for candles and coal. She was trapped. She could not return to France, where she would likely be arrested as an aristocrat and sent to the guillotine. She could not stay in London without money, where debtor's prison was a very real threat. She began to sell her life piece by piece. First went the jewelry, the diamond rings given to her by Empress Elizabeth of Russia, the gold snuff boxes from English lords. Then went the clothes. The silk gowns were sold to second-hand dealers, replaced by simple wool. But the greatest heartbreak came in 1793, when she was forced to sell her library. D'Eon was a bibliophile of the highest order. Her collection contained over 6,000 volumes. It was one of the finest private libraries in London, filled with rare manuscripts, ancient philosophy, military treatises, and religious texts. These books were her friends. They were the only things that didn't judge her, didn't stare at her chin, didn't ask her to lift her skirts. They were her intellectual sanctuary. When the auctioneers from Christie's came to catalog them, it was like they were cataloging her own limbs. The sale was publicized widely. The library of the celebrated Chevalier D'Eon. People came to buy the books not just for their content, but for the novelty of owning something that belonged to the man-woman. Watching her beloved books being carried away, D'Eon wrote, "I am now a body without a soul, but a body still needs to eat." Desperate, D'Eon returned to the only skill she had left. She turned her life into a circus act. At the age of 65, she resumed her fencing exhibitions. It was a tragic spectacle. The nobility of the fencing match with Saint Georges was gone. Now she was performing in theaters and public halls, sometimes between acts of jugglers and acrobats. She fenced against anyone who would pay, local masters, young upstarts, even curious amateurs. She billed herself as the modern Minerva. Posters went up around London and the provincial towns. Come see the old heroine, the wonder of the age. She wore her black dress, now frayed at the hems, and her battered cross of Saint Louis. She would step onto the stage, the lights dim, the crowd jeering or cheering, and she would fight. And the miracle was, she was still good. The speed was gone, but the guile remained. She knew every trick in the book. She could disarm a man with a flick of her wrist before he even knew what happened. She humiliated men a third of her age, and for a few minutes every night, she was the captain of dragoons again. However, the body has limits. In August 1796, during an exhibition in Southampton, disaster struck. She was 68 years old. During a match, a foil broke. A jagged shard of steel snapped off and pierced her right armpit, driving deep into the muscle, dangerously close to the lung. The wound was serious. For a younger person, it might have been a recovery of weeks. For Dion, living in a cold boarding house with poor nutrition, it was a catastrophe. The wound festered. She was bedridden for months. The fencing career was over. The sword, her companion since she was a boy in Tonnerre, was finally laid down for good. Now, truly alone and unable to work, Dion faced the abyss. But in this darkness, a new character entered the story, a character who brings a sudden tender warmth to this cold narrative. Her name was Mrs. Mary Cole. She was a French widow living in London, a woman of no great fortune, but immense heart. She had known Dion for years, perhaps as a casual acquaintance, but when she saw the Chevalier sinking into destitution, she did not turn away. Mrs. Cole took Dion in. They moved into a small, cramped apartment at 26 New Millman Street, near the Foundling Hospital. It was a household of two elderly women, or so the world thought, scraping by on the margins of society. Mrs. Cole became Dion's protector, her nurse, and her only friend. There is something deeply moving about this domestic arrangement. After a life of kings, empresses, spies, and wars, Dion's world shrank to the size of a sitting room. In this small room, Dion became a recluse. She rarely went out during the day. The London streets were too dangerous for an old woman who looked like a man, and the taunts of street urchins were too painful to bear. She spent her days writing. She wrote compulsively. She wrote letters to the French government that were never answered, demanding her pension. She wrote theological essays. She wrote endless pages of memoirs, rewriting her life over and over again, trying to make sense of the chaos. The ambiguity of her gender never left her, even in these twilight years. In fact, it deepened. To Mrs. Cole and her few visitors, Dion was undoubtedly a woman. She behaved with the piety and modesty of a nun. She prayed for hours. She spoke of her lost innocence as a girl. Yet physically, the male characteristics were becoming undeniable. She had to shave, though she often let the stubble grow when she was alone. Her voice, always raspy, grew deeper. There is a fascinating anecdote from this period. A friend stopped by to visit and found Dion shaving in front of a mirror. Caught in the act, Dion didn't panic. She simply turned and said, "This is the curse of my family. All the women of the Dions have beards as they age. It is a trial sent by God." She had an answer for everything. She had constructed a reality that was impervious to logic. But poverty was the one enemy she could not fence with. By the early 1800s, Dion and Mrs. Cole were living in squalor. They were imprisoned for debt for 5 months in 1804, a humiliating ordeal for a person who had once held the fate of nations in her hands. In prison, Dion was housed in the women's ward. The other female prisoners, rough women of the London underclass, accepted her. They saw a tall, strong old lady who could tell stories about Russia and wars. They protected her. It was a strange sisterhood, far removed from the salons of Versailles, but perhaps more genuine. When she was released, she returned to New Millman Street. She was now in her late 70s. Her health was failing. She developed rheumatism, making it hard to walk. She spent most of her time in bed. The world had moved on. Napoleon Bonaparte was now the Emperor of France. The map of Europe was being redrawn again. But the name Chevalier d'Eon had faded into a legend, a trivia question for the old generation. Whatever happened to that spy? People would ask. Dead, surely, came the reply. But she was not dead. She was lying in a dimly lit room in London, holding on to a rosary, dreaming of dragoons. The isolation was profound. She had outlived her enemies. Louis XV was dead. Louis XVI was dead. Beaumarchais was dead. She was the last survivor of the Secret du Roi, the last witness to the hidden history of the 18th century. In 1809, as she approached her 81st birthday, d'Eon fell while getting out of bed. She was frail, and the fall was severe. She was confined to her mattress, unable to move. Mrs. Cole nursed her with the devotion of a saint, feeding her broth, washing her, and reading to her. It was a slow fading. The fire that had burned so brightly in the fencing halls and the palaces was flickering out. As death approached, d'Eon seemed to find a kind of peace. She no longer spoke of wars or debts. She spoke of God. She had spent her life being defined by others, by her father, by the king, by the betting public. Now, in the quiet of the sick room, she was finally just a soul preparing to leave a body that had caused so much confusion. On May 21st, 1810, the end came. The Chevalier d'Eon de Beaumont died in her sleep. Mrs. Cole, weeping, closed the eyes of her friend. She began the preparations to lay out the body, to wash and dress her companion for the final rest. Mrs. Cole had lived with d'Eon for nearly 15 years. She had shared a table, a home, and a life. She believed with every fiber of her being that d'Eon was a woman. She had never seen d'Eon unclothed. The Chevalier had been fanatically modest, always sleeping in heavy robes, always dressing behind screens. Mrs. Cole prepared the water and the linens. She pulled back the sheets to wash the body of the woman she had cared for. And then, in the silence of that London bedroom, Mrs. Mary Cole let out a scream that could be heard in the street. The shock was absolute. Mrs. Cole collapsed. She had spent decades protecting a woman, only to find that she had been living with a man. Or had she? The body on the bed was biologically male, yes, but the person she knew was Genevieve. The confusion that d'Eon had managed to juggle for 81 years had finally crashed down in the moment of death. Mrs. Cole's scream was the bell that summoned the world back to d'Eon's side. The neighbors came running. The doctor was summoned. And soon the news leaked out. The mystery was over. The betting books could finally be settled. But the world demanded proof. They would not take the word of a fainting widow. The scientific men, the doctors, and the surgeons of London sharpened their scalpels. They were coming to claim the body. The final invasion of privacy was about to begin. The room at 26 New Millman Street, usually a sanctuary of prayer and quiet endurance, was transformed within hours into a theater of the macabre. Mrs. Cole's scream had shattered the silence, but what followed was the heavy, bureaucratic tramping of boots. The news traveled through the London grapevine with the speed of a contagion. The Chevalier is dead, and the secret is out. For 33 years, the world had been forced to accept the King of France's decree that d'Eon was a woman. The betting books had been closed. The arguments had been settled. d'Eon had lived, dressed, and suffered as a woman. But death has a way of revoking royal decrees. In the absence of the soul, the body becomes public property, especially when that body has been the subject of £100,000 in wagers. The first to arrive on the scene were not the mourners, but the skeptics. The Earl of Yarborough, who had long held an interest in the case, was notified. Legal representatives for various parties, who still held grudges or curiosity from the 1770s, betting scandal descended upon the modest flat. Poor Mrs. Cole, still in a state of shock, was pushed aside. She was no longer the grieving companion. She was the dupe, the victim of a decades-long prank, or so the whispering men insinuated. To settle the matter once and for all, a definitive medical examination was required. This was not to be a quiet family affair. It was to be an inquest. On May 23, 1810, 2 days after Deon's death, a team of surgeons led by Mr. Thomas Copeland arrived. They brought their instruments, their sketch pads, and their cold, clinical detachment. They were joined by a group of distinguished witnesses, including the Prince de Condé and other French exiles, who needed to know if the soldier they had fought alongside was truly one of them. Imagine the indignity of it. The body of the 81-year-old diplomat, who had guarded her modesty with a ferocity bordering on paranoia, was stripped naked under the gaze of a dozen men. The layers of flannel, the skirts, the petticoats, the armor she had worn to convince the world of her gender, were peeled away. Mr. Copeland performed the dissection. The silence in the room must have been suffocating as he made his examination. And then he took a quill and drafted the certificate that would be published in every newspaper from London to St. Petersburg. The language was direct, brutal, and devoid of nuance. I hereby certify that I have inspected and dissected the body of the Chevalier d'Eon in the presence of Mr. Adair, Mr. Wilson, and Le Père Élysée, and have found the male organs in every respect perfectly formed. There it was, the biological truth. In the binary logic of 1810, d'Eon was a man. The bets were retroactively settled. The King of France had been wrong. The world had been fooled. However, the report did not stop there, and this is where the story resists the simple label of fraud. While Copeland confirmed the primary male characteristics, the rest of his report reads like a confusion of medical science. He noted that the body displayed unusual roundness in the limbs. He noted the remarkable fullness of the breasts. He observed that the beard was slight, the skin soft, and the fat distribution distinctly feminine. The witnesses signed the affidavit, but they left the room scratching their heads. Yes, d'Eon was male, but he was a male who had physically morphed into something else. Was it the result of 30 years of wearing corsets that reshaped the torso? Was it a hormonal condition like Kallmann syndrome or androgen insensitivity, as some modern doctors suspect? Or was it simply that d'Eon had lived the role so completely that the body had complied with the mind's command? We will never know. But the ambiguity that d'Eon cultivated in life lingered on the autopsy table. When the certificate was published in the Times, the public reaction was not one of sympathy. It was a carnival. The British press, vicious at the best of times, tore d'Eon's legacy to shreds. They ignored the heroism at Willinghausen. They ignored the peace treaty of 1763. They focused entirely on the hoax. Caricature artists who had made a fortune mocking d'Eon in the 1770s sharpened their pencils for one last attack. New prints appeared in the shop windows of the Strand. They depicted d'Eon as a two-headed monster or as a satyr hiding under a dress. They mocked the fencing match with Saint-Georges, suggesting that the legendary swordsman must have known he was fighting a man and played along. The narrative was rewritten overnight. d'Eon was no longer the Amazon heroine. He was the old imposter. The sense of betrayal was particularly acute among the feminist thinkers of the time. For years, d'Eon had been held up as proof that a woman could do anything a man could do: fight, spy, argue, and fence. Mary Robinson, a famous writer and feminist, had praised Dion as the champion of her sex. Now that champion was revealed to be a man. The victory was hollow. It felt like a cruel joke. If the only woman who could defeat men at swordplay was actually a man, then the arguments for female equality lost one of their most visible icons. But the person who suffered most was Mrs. Cole. She had lived in poverty with Dion, shared her bread and her prayers. Now she was the laughingstock of London. The widow who didn't know her husband was a man, the paper sneered. She was accused of being a conspirator, of helping Dion swindle the public. The truth, that she was a kind-hearted woman who had respected her friend's privacy, was too boring for the tabloids. Mrs. Cole vanished into the shadows of history, a collateral victim of Dion's complex life. Dion was buried on May 28, 1810, in the churchyard of St. Pancras Old Church in London. It was a strange funeral. The coffin plate read, Charles Geneviève Louise Auguste André Timothée Dion de Beaumont, reclaiming the full string of names, but the identity of the person inside was more fractured than ever. There were no military honors. There was no salute from the dragoons. Just a quiet interment in foreign soil, far from the vineyards of Tonnerre. To the Victorians, the Chevalier Dion was merely a punchline, a cautionary tale of a man trapped in a dress by his own deception. When the autopsy of 1810 declared it is a man, the world believed the joke was over. However, history is not static. As modern science and historians have dusted off the archives, a different truth has emerged. From Havelock Ellis coining the term eonism to modern medical theories suggesting Dion may have had an intersex condition like Klinefelter syndrome, we now understand that the masquerade was likely a desperate attempt to articulate a biological and spiritual reality that the 18th century had no language for. Dion's rewriting of personal history was not a lie, but a form of self-healing, a way to survive in a binary world that had no place for such complexity. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in the fact that Dion's physical remains were likely lost beneath the steam and iron of the St. Pancras Railway, paved over by the industrial age. Yet, while the bones vanished, the spirit proved impossible to bury. In the ancestral home in Tonnerre, the dragoon's cold steel pistol and the lady's delicate silk fan sit side by side. For centuries, these objects seemed to belong to two different people, but in truth, they were both weapons wielded by the same hand, one to defend the body, the other to defend the soul. Dion carved out a third space in a two-sided world, proving that the mask was actually the face. Ultimately, the legacy of the Chevalier Dion asks us a question that resonates across centuries. Who owns your identity? Is it the state, the doctors, or you? Dion answered with a resounding defiance, refusing to let the world dictate the boundaries of the self. By living for 33 years in the face of mockery, poverty, and isolation, Dion proved that the rarest bravery is not found on the battlefield, but in the courage to be oneself. The spy who lived twice left us a fortune, not in gold, but in the enduring proof that the human spirit is too vast, too complex, and too beautiful to ever be captured by a single label.